Welcome everybody to the U.S. military and the climate emergency plenary session. Today we're going to hear from Phyllis Bennis, writer, activist, and political commentator. She will speak on militarism and climate change. Lindsay Koshagarian, program director, National Priorities Project, where her work has been at the intersection of military and domestic federal spending. We'll hear from Marc Brodine, author of Green Strategy, and numerous articles which focus on how to build a massive worldwide movement to create fundamental change. He will be introduced by Arturo Cambron, member of Military Family Speak Out. Jim Driscoll, VFP member, longtime activist, and founder of Extinction Rebellion DC. Jim will talk about direct actions needed to achieve a zero greenhouse gas emissions economy. Now this is going to sound like an admonition, but it's really not. It's a title. Pay attention. Stop looking everywhere but at the disaster unfolding around you. Focus. Focus and see the shriveled crops, raisins on the vine, dried lake beds, flooded coasts, villages swallowed in mud where permafrost once stood firm. Look in your rear view at landscapes buried in concrete, easing the way for us to speed by rather than pass through, our vehicles absorbing huge quantities of fuel sucked from the corpses of ancient animals rendered and poured into the hot throats of land, sea, and air transport, discharging foul gases, displacing life-supporting oxygen, trapping our delicate blue marble under a life-choking lid. Think about military might explosively projected in pursuit of enrichment, plundering and destroying while consuming enough fossil fuel to run a modest-sized country. Look far ahead. Imagine and create another world where people will finally learn to unfold the secrets of life rather than rip them open, consume in moderation, generously receive one another, assist one another in the massive task of restoring the balance of nature, and apply the love you reserve for the few to everything. Let's see. I'm sorry, I'm missing my note here. Well, our first speaker is Phyllis Bennis. I had a whole bunch of stuff to say about you, Phyllis, but I have misplaced it.
Not to worry, Woody.
Okay, please take off for me.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Woody. Thank you to Veterans for Peace for being here, even though it's virtual. Being part of the VFP convention every year is a highlight for me. I had the honor a couple of years ago of being made a lifetime member of Veterans for Peace, an honorary member since I'm not a military vet. I'm a vet of the anti-war movement, but it meant a great deal. And so I'm very glad to be with you tonight. I wanted to start by reminding us of something that Dr. King taught us many years ago. He said that a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And I would add that these days, we're also approaching the physical death of our species on this planet. Because we know, and as veterans, you know more than most of us, how war and militarism cause climate crisis. And the climate crisis causes wars. That intersection is at the core of what we'll be talking about tonight. You all know the Pentagon is the biggest institutional producer of greenhouse gases in the world. Our Pentagon, more than many countries. We can look at other examples. In Syria, the horrific war there that became a global as well as a regional as well as an internal war over the last years. One of the major causes, not the only cause, of course, but one of the major causes of the war in Syria had to do with a 3-year-long drought where 800,000 Syrian farmers and their families were thrown off the land where they could no longer make a living because of the drought, forced into the cities. This was between 2006 and 2009, where because there had been a shift from a kind of state-run capitalism, if you will, a kind of socialism, not really, in the past, but now a real kind of neoliberalism had taken over. Jobs were scarce. It led to a rise of a kind of sectarianism that had never really been a problem before in Syria, with all other problems that existed. That was not one of them. And one of the things that led to war was the consequences of that drought. And we see that around the world. We see it in so many places. I'm going to leave it to my colleague, Lindsay Koshgarian, because I'm very glad that the National Priorities Project, which many of you know, I think, from their work for so many years, is now a project of the Institute for Policy Studies. So I get to call Lindsay all the time and ask her all the questions that I used to have to send an email and wait, and it's great. And so I'm going to leave her to talk about the basics of the costs of war and what that money could be used for. But I want to just give one figure to start with tonight, and that is 53 cents. 53 cents out of every discretionary federal dollar that we have goes directly to the military. Only 15 cents goes to anti-poverty programs, but 53 cents goes to the military. So when people say, well, how are you going to pay for a Green New Deal? How are you going to pay for Medicare for all? How are you going to pay for free college education? One of the answers is we stop putting 53 cents out of every federal dollar into the military. That's our starting point. But another starting point has to do with the origins of this country. Militarism, as you all know, was central in the creation of the United States in the first years of white settler colonialism on this land. You know, the great historian Howard Zinn taught us that the United States history is rooted in the legacies of slavery and genocide. Genocide against the native population, the enslavement of Black Africans brought here in chains. And that also included the destruction of the indigenous environment. That was part of what it meant to commit genocide against Native people, to make the land available to white settlers. Part of that destruction of the indigenous environment meant destroying those parts of the environment, like the buffalo on the plains, that made the lives of Native folks in those areas possible. When the buffalo were killed, the people who relied on them for so many things were killed as well. That was part of the genocide. You remember the statements of the Colonel John Chivington, who of course was also a Methodist minister, who led a military attack on a peaceful set of villages in Sand Creek. And he said at the time, when some of the soldiers said to him, why can we attack this village? They're not doing anything. And we promised them to protect them. We promised to treat them as peaceful residents, not as the enemy. And Chivington's answer famously, infamously, was to damn any man who sympathizes with Indians, kill and scalp them all, big and little, nits make lice. That was the theme of the wars against Native people, and it had everything to do with destroying the environment that supported those Native populations across this country. When Manifest Destiny took hold and the US moved west to take over more and more land, to kill more and more people, the military technology that was used, the conquest of the land, the prevention of people who had lived with and in nature for so many decades, so many centuries by then, suddenly was no longer possible. So that intersection of the destruction of the environment using the tools of militarism meant that the intersection between war and environmental degradation was true from the very origins of this country. Today, we see the fight over pipelines and Standing Rock, the latest version of colonial destruction of the environment once again. And US veterans, as you all know, many from Veterans for Peace, stood with the people of Standing Rock to fight back against that encroachment on the last of the environment that survived. And something else that Howard Zinn taught us when he taught us the origins of how this country was created, he said that it was not only created based on the legacy of slavery and genocide, but it was also created based on the legacy of the movements that rose to fight against genocide and slavery from the very beginning. And it's those movements on whose shoulders we stand today. That's what's so extraordinary about the history of this country, that from the beginning, there were also movements for abolition that shaped part of what became the environmental protection movement so much later. It wasn't called that, but that was part of it from the very beginning. So when we talk about the costs of war, both in this country and around the world, we have to look at what were the environmental costs, as well as the human costs, the economic costs, all the human rights costs. Part of those costs were the environmental costs. It's much higher, of course, in targeted countries than it is today. But those collective costs, costs to the environment, costs in the loss of sovereignty, all of that is fundamental to how the United States wages war around the world today. And the links between those wars abroad and the destruction of the environment and racism and Islamophobia at home that are used to build support for those wars mean that we have to make that kind of intersectionality part of everything that we do. So when we talk about building a movement against war and building a movement against destruction of the climate and destruction of the environment, that means that we have to make sure that all of the movements we work with, the immigrant rights movement, the LGBT rights movement, the women's movement, the labor movement, all of these partner movements, we have to be sure that we are getting to them all the information they need to include within their work the understanding of the role of militarism, environmental degradation, and racism at the heart of everything that those movements are about. So when we talk internationally, in the past, of course, here, it was about killing off the buffalo so that Native people, Native communities in those plains areas had no way to survive. What we see today is the rise of military bases around the world that collectively destroy enormous amounts of territory, destroy the environments in which those bases exist. 10% of the Superfund sites here in the United States, 141 of them, are military sites. 760 abandoned bases in the United States have become environmental target zones that have never been fully dealt with. Internationally, along with killing civilians, along with the attacks on women that surround the military bases that exist around the world, the war crimes that have been carried out by soldiers stationed on those bases, undermining the sovereignty and diplomatic rights of people in those countries, violations of international law. We also have the environmental consequences of those acts of war. We have the nuclear consequences that we're commemorating now, the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And along with the destruction of lives, the destruction of societies, we have this incredible, long-lasting environmental degradation that made those cities, those regions, uninhabitable for so long. We have the results even today of Agent Orange in Indochina that came to symbolize what that war was all about. In Iraq, it was depleted uranium that came to symbolize the attacks on the climate, on the children, on the environment of Iraq when the US went to war there. Today, in the post 9/11 wars, as you all know, and as our younger comrades in About Face and the other organizations of anti-war veterans of the post 9/11 wars, it's the burn pits that have become the Agent Orange of today's wars, that destroy the environment where they exist, that destroy the health of the people who are forced to create them and use them and work with them, and that destroy the lives of children who live in those areas. So once again, we have these environmental catastrophes that continue as a component of US wars around the world. We have environmental catastrophes in so many places that are creating huge refugee crises. And those refugee crises increase the threat of war and increase the violence of war. In Syria, it didn't just happen as an original cause of the wars in Syria. Today, the combination of continuing war and environmental degradation is creating huge numbers of refugees from Syria, internally displaced people and refugees forced out of the country. So when we talk about the consequences of war, we have to continue to look at how the environment gets destroyed. When we talk about the 800 US military bases around the world, we have to look at what those bases have done to the environment that surrounds them. In Italy, one of the NATO bases that the US is trying to expand in, I'm forgetting the name of the city. It's the city where Romeo and Juliet was set. Somebody will remind me what the city was. But the expansion of that base that the US was trying to build some years back would have destroyed a whole range of historic buildings and cultural centers that had been around for more than 300 years in that area, destroying the human environment as well as the climate environment. All of this is central to how the US wages wars around the world. So when we talk about that 53 cents of every federal dollar going to the military, this is what it's paying for. And what it's not paying for, you'll hear more from Lindsay, but what it's not paying for, as we know, is the Green New Deal and Medicare for all. When we stop the killing of people around the world, we also stop killing the environment. And we can't afford not to do both. We have to look at how all of the militarism and the militarization that goes on within our communities also affects the environment. When the National Guard, when the military was brought out against the fighters, the water protectors in Standing Rock, that was also water that was being threatened. People's right to water is being denied. And that's part of the militarization that we fight against. So when the work of Veterans for Peace is remembered years from now, as it will be, part of that legacy will be stopping the wars that kill people, stopping the wars that sap the financing of social programs that are so urgent, both in this country and around the world, and stopping the militarized actions that are destroying the environment. Thank you all, and I look forward to our discussion tonight.
All right, can you hear me? Thank you very much, Phyllis. I'm afraid I'm not showing up here. Okay.
We can still hear you, Woody. It's okay.
Oh, okay, good. That was terrific, Phyllis. I thank you very much, and you were so gracious to just pick up where I stumbled. Our next speaker is Lindsay Kushigarian, Executive Director of National Priorities Project. Her commentary on the federal budget and military spending has appeared on NPR, the NBC, CNN, The Nation, the US News and World Report, and others. At National Priorities Project, her work has been at the intersection of military and domestic federal spending. She will be talking about the US military budget and its impact on the environment and climate crisis. I give you Lindsay Kushigarian.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking your Tuesday night to think about the climate change and militarism problem. I hope that when you leave here tonight, you'll feel not just depressed, but also hopeful and energized and like we can do something about this, and we can, and many people are. I am going to talk primarily about our federal spending and where we put our resources and where we don't put our resources. But in order to do that, I'm also going to talk a little bit about things that Phyllis mentioned in a couple of different contexts. One of those is the militarization of our society, broadly speaking. It's not just wars overseas. And the other is why greening the military is not an appropriate solution or part of the solution to the problem. And part of this is National Priorities Project, which is the project I direct, which is a part of the Institute for Policy Studies, along with Phyllis Bennis's project. We put out a report earlier this year called No Warming, No War, how militarism fuels the climate crisis and vice versa. And it was an explainer for climate change activists. And ever since then, we've been holding webinars. We would have held trainings, but here we are all living in Zoom world now. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what we've been saying in those trainings with this particular focus on the spending. So first of all, Phyllis mentioned the role of the Pentagon as a major polluter. The 800 bases and military installations around the world are a big part of that. And when you put it all together, the Pentagon's annual greenhouse gas emissions are greater than the greenhouse gas emissions of countries like Sweden, Denmark, and Portugal. So it's an entire nation spread out all over the world. And there is actual land, as we all know, involved as well as emissions. Those 800 bases also, by one estimate, cost us $150 billion every year to maintain. And just to put that into context, that's about twice as much as the federal budget for education. So it's a huge amount of money. It's a huge cost to us to keep these 800 bases going around the world. And the military has acknowledged as much. I'm going to read you a quote from a report by the U.S. Army Petroleum and Water Department in Fort Lee. The report says, "Fuel is the blood of the military and is critical to the life of the theater of operation." That's a pretty visceral picture, I think. And it's a fact. The Pentagon and the US military, as we know it, could not exist without oil. We know that oil is the leading cause of war, and that an estimated quarter to a half of all interstate wars since 1973 have been linked to oil. Needless to say, that includes most of our US wars during that time frame. And I'm going to read you another quote. This is circa about 2008 from General John Abizaid, the former commander of CENTCOM, who said, "Of course it's about oil. We can't really deny that." That's about as open an admission as you'll ever get. And what he didn't say is that the US military spends about $80 billion a year to protect the world's oil supplies. And that doesn't include the cost of the Iraq war, which, needless to say, adds many, many billions of dollars to that figure. So we are pouring our resources into securing the oil supply for ourselves and our allies, and we are not pouring equal resources into solutions to climate change. Now, one thing you'll hear even from people on the left is that part of the solution to climate change and part of the solution to all of these terrible emissions that we've been talking about and wars for oil and all of these things is greening the military. And what that means, it's supposed to mean a number of things, including things like changing the military's fuel sources and reducing their fuel use, making bases more efficient. And this is a really dangerous idea for people on the left to endorse and to talk about. It's dangerous because the Pentagon is not interested in limiting climate change for its own sake. It is only interested in limiting climate change because it is for its own narrow self-interests. The Pentagon's concerns about climate change are its military infrastructure, finding green fuels to power the forces partly to reduce costs, and security threats in a warming climate, which Phyllis talked about. and which are not humanitarian concerns to the Pentagon, but as they call them, security threats. A 2016 Pentagon report said the DoD must be able to adapt current and future operations to address the impacts of climate change in order to maintain an effective and efficient US military. The Pentagon is not a real partner to address climate change. It is not going to be a real partner to address climate change. And we need to recognize that fact if we're going to solve the climate problem. We also need to recognize that a just solution to climate change can't be based on militarism. There is a flow chart that we use in our report from the climate movement. It's a complicated thing, and it shows how, it shows all the different pieces of climate change in the extractive economy and how we can change that to a living economy. And it recognizes militarism as one of those forces that is keeping us stuck in the extractive economy, the economy of extracting oil, the economy of burning and dumping resources, of keeping wealth and power in the same few hands. And as Phyllis talked about, it's not just war that results and that is intimately tied with climate change. Folks who fight to protect their lands from extractive industries are often met with state military or paramilitary violence. In 2018, more than 3 people were murdered on average each week for defending their land and environment. And that doesn't include people who are criminalized, beaten, injured, or otherwise persecuted. That's 3 murders every week in 2018 for people defending their land and environment. This is an incredibly militarized system. We also know that there is a big refugee problem and that the Pentagon is going to adopt all the wrong solutions to it. Climate change is driving the refugee problem, and the Pentagon has recognized this for decades. In a 2003 report, the Pentagon, a report commissioned by the Pentagon, stated that the United States and Australia are likely to build defensive fortresses around their countries because they have the resources and reserves to achieve self-sufficiency. And we see that happening now. We see the defensive fortress. We hear about the wall at the southern border. And this is intimately tied to climate change. And until we recognize the problem that is militarism, we will not be able to turn our attention to the right solutions. Between 2008 and 2015, an average of 20 million people were displaced every year based on climate-related hazards. And the numbers are expected to balloon in the coming years. There are estimates ranging from 200 million people who will be displaced by the middle of the century on up to possibly as many as 1 billion people by the middle of the century. So this problem is only getting worse. And this costs a lot of money. The US military budget is far larger than our budget for immigration enforcement, but for example, the US Customs and Border Protection has a full fleet of Predator B drones built for military use at $17 million a piece. Those drones cost the federal government $32,000 every time they're used to apprehend a single individual, $32,000 for every person. Most of us could put solar panels on our houses for less than that. The full cost of all of this is almost off the charts. Now, Phyllis mentioned that 53 cents on the dollar is the military budget, 53 cents out of every dollar that Congress allocates each year. But an additional 11% goes toward militarized government functions, including immigration enforcement, homeland security, border patrol, ICE, all of these systems that are kind of trying to maintain the status quo of the United States hoarding resources, hoarding land, and keeping other people out. In 2020, the military budget was 272 times what the federal government spent on energy efficiency and renewable energy, almost 300 times as much. We also know that there is a so-called Department of Energy, but the Department of Energy is not a Department of Energy. In 2020, the Department of Energy had a budget of $38 billion, and more than 60% of that was for nuclear weapons, not for energy at all. Now, there's also nuclear energy in that budget and some energy related things, but far more than half of the Department of Energy budget is for nuclear weapons. Now, most of us know that the Department of Defense is a misnomer, but the Department of Energy is possibly even more of a misnomer. According to the Brown University Costs of War Project, we've spent $6.4 trillion on war in the last 2 decades. 6.4 trillion, that's a number that's almost impossible to imagine. Maybe it is impossible for most of us to imagine. But just by comparison, the cost of shifting our national power grid to 100% renewable sources is estimated at 4.5 trillion. 6.4 trillion on war over the last 10 years versus 4.5 trillion to transition to a renewable energy grid. That choice should turn all of our stomachs. It's an absolutely unforgivable choice that we have made as a country, and we need to turn that around. We know the reasons why we can't turn this around. More than half of the Pentagon budget goes to contractors. In 2018, the CEO of Lockheed Martin made 191 times its median employee's pay. This is maintaining economic inequality, it's maintaining climate change, it's maintaining US militarism, and the cost is really unacceptable. Of course, there is also profit on the fossil fuel side. And the CEO of Chevron, one of the greatest polluters in history, made 152 times its median employee's pay. So we know where the real motivations for these things are coming from. They're coming from profit motives for military contractors and fossil fuel companies. We also know that not only is the military complex and the militarized budget costing us nearly $900 billion a year, but an additional more than $600 billion a year goes to subsidize directly and indirectly fossil fuel companies. We're spending a huge amount. If we could cut the $649 billion a year in subsidies for coal, oil, and gas, and if we could cut the $350 billion a year that we've recommended cutting from the Pentagon budget, it would free up almost $1 trillion every year that we could turn to the problem of climate change. So we know what the problems are and we know what the solutions are. And of course, our job is to be activists and to go out there and keep working and not let occasional losses like our loss on a 10% Pentagon cut a couple of weeks ago, to not let those stop us. And we need to build ties with the climate change movement in order to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Our next speaker is going to be introduced by I'm getting very, oh, okay. Arturo Cambron.
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Okay, of MFSO, you will introduce Marc Brodine. Thank you.
I sure will. First of all, I want to thank Veterans for Peace for inviting MFSO to participate in this panel discussion. MFSO, real briefly, is a national organization that came together soon after 9/11. Our mission statement is very straightforward and simple: support our troops, bring them home now, and take care of them when they get home. If anybody's interested in finding more about our organization, we're having an MFSO caucus tomorrow, Wednesday. It's an online open house and meetup at 5:30 Pacific. You can get more information on our webpage, mfso.org. Anyway, when we first talked about MFSO participating in a workshop on the military as it relates to the environmental challenge, I immediately thought of my friend Marc Brodine, who is the author of this excellent book called The Green Strategy. I've sat down on several of Marc's presentations and found them extremely informative. They're thought-provoking and uplifting. And that's kind of unusual because a lot of people, when we talk about the environmental crisis, is very depressing in terms of we're in this crisis and we need to, it just seems like overwhelming. But the positive thing about Marc is that he not only talks about the importance and the crisis that exists right now, but also about what we can do. It's very proactive in the sense we can do this. So Marc, besides being the author, is a union and community activist, a writer, teacher, hospital orderly, and a technician. And on top of all of that, he's a really good blues guitar player. Unfortunately, we won't have time to hear you, but it gives me great pleasure to introduce Marc.
Thank you, Arturo, and thanks to Veterans for Peace for inviting me, allowing me to be part of this panel. I want to start by discussing the largest context for the environmental problems we face before mentioning some ways the U.S. military adds to the problems and talking a bit about what we can do about it. While many focus on climate change as if it was a separate issue, it's really just the most basic symptom of an underlying problem, a massive and growing imbalance between humanity and the natural world that humanity relies on for its existence. This imbalance is not just a question of the number of people, but it's more so of the ways in which raw materials are extracted, energy used and wasted, the ways all goods and food are produced and distributed, the toxic chemicals we use in the process, and the ways we dispose of waste. And as has already been discussed, the military plays a particularly heinous role in many of those things, but it is definitely not limited to that. So it is certainly about greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also about toxic chemicals, about the wasteful production of crap and unnecessary stuff. It's about agricultural practices like industrial scale agribusiness monoculture and factory farming. It's about pesticides, herbicides, and insecticides. It's about how we are paving over way too much land with impervious materials. And it's about the cumulative impact of all of those on the ability of nature to restore itself, to regenerate the ecological services on which humanity depends for its survival. All this means we need to have a fundamental transformation of all the ways in which we interact with nature. The military is responsible for many insults to our shared environment. The role of US military bases around the world, has been mentioned, contributes to greenhouse gas emissions in several ways. The required amount of fossil fuels necessary to transport troops and equipment and supplies to all those bases around the world, the energy use, excess military equipment and buildings and paving over of surfaces that all those bases represent. There's also harm from military testing, like the Yakima firing range in eastern Washington, near where I live, which basically turns what could be either a natural world which would help provide us with oxygen and beauty, or a place to grow food that we need, and instead has created a moonscape of destruction, devastating these massive amounts of otherwise usable land. There's also the environmental and health harm done to members of the military and their families, from emissions, pollution, harmful chemicals, all the way up to the use of Agent Orange, harming the environment and the local population and the members of the military all at once. So there's harm to the world's environment and to our economy from any and all military action, from the production of military goods, from war, especially nuclear war, and nuclear war is among the greatest danger to the world's environment. So while there are steps that could be taken by the military which could have a positive impact, often, as people have pointed out, that's a greenwashing of the role of the military. So the thing I want to point out is that many discussions of the environment and books about the climate crisis and other environmental problems and catastrophes talk about the science, explain the science in, in layman's terms, or they offer, 50 ways you as an individual can save the world. Recycling, buying a hybrid car, there's long lists, and all of those are good choices to make if you can make them and afford them. But all of these discussions leave out what I think is the most crucial aspect, the need to build a movement with the political and economic power to force fundamental change on a resistant system. And this is because it is not enough to understand the science, because individual changes only have a significant impact if they're adopted by millions or billions of people. It is mostly because it's not enough to change our personal habits, because the biggest insults to the environment are the result of the actions of the systems embedded in the world around us. Mining, industry, agriculture, the military, building practices, how we heat and cool buildings, how we transport people and goods and food. And those systems have a much bigger impact than just what we as individuals can do. For example, we have a massive waste problem that often gets ignored, but the piles of waste growing up in garbage dumps and in landfills, they're trying to ship trash around the world to get rid of it. And we could make a dent in that through personal recycling. But if 100% of our trash, our personal trash, got recycled or reused or done in other ways other than disposing of it, that would only hit about 5 to 7% of the problem. The rest of it comes from industry, from agriculture, from business, from offices, and those the cumulative impact of all those systems are what is really making the difference. There's about 100 companies that are responsible for about 70% of all the emissions of greenhouse gases into the environment over the history of the world. And that's much more than you and I can impact. So we have to recognize that change doesn't happen just because it should. It only happens when a movement of hope, vision, power, and sophistication makes it impossible to continue in the old ways. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a struggle. We need a grand coalition, a movement of movements in order to build the political power to institute fundamental change, to make it too expensive to continue in the old ways. And in this effort, this kind of grand alliance, tacit or explicit, can unite all progressive movements for workers' rights, for racial justice and equality, for women's rights, for an end to police brutality, for a livable wage, for healthcare for all, for immigrant rights, for full civil rights for everyone, regardless of race, gender, age, education, or income, to mention just a few of those movements. In the process of building this movement of movements, the peace movement needs to play and can play a crucial unifying role. And organizations like yours can connect issues of an end to military aggression and invasion, a decent environment for all humanity, and a future for ourselves and our descendants. And one of the things that's important for people in all these movements to understand is that it's not about dropping the struggles you are currently engaged in. It's about recognizing that all progressive movements have an environmental aspect to them, and that the fight for peace is about morality, about justice, about saving lives, about preventing war, about not sending troops into harm's way for the sake of profits or geopolitical gains, but it is also about our shared environment and future. Nuclear war and also conventional war are the most environmentally destructive things that nations engage in. This makes for a natural connection between the peace and environmental movements as part of that broader coalition. And the Green New Deal offers a tool to build that broad-based unity, linking issues of healthcare, racial and gender justice, environmental action, approaching the scale of the problems we need to address. Like the Paris Climate Accords, by itself it is not enough, but it's one way we can build united action. We live at a time of both a rising danger of full-fledged fascism and also a rising progressive movement. And it's our job to help create links, solidarity, mutual understanding, and joint action. And that action needs to be in our country, but it's also worldwide, because environmental crises are worldwide. When the seas rise, every country touched by those seas is affected. When windstorms in China blow sand into the atmosphere, some of that sand ends up in the atmosphere above Los Angeles. The whole world needs peace in order to address these crises, for financial reasons, for moral reasons, for policy reasons, for focus reasons, and many others. The peace movement, including Veterans for Peace, can work at the intersections between military policy, foreign policy, and domestic issues, and build that alliance, as we see with the wall of vets in Portland joining the wall of moms, and the dads with leaf blowers, and the massive Black Lives Matter protests that we've seen around the country. So it's about connecting these movements and building this coalition of coalitions is about a peaceful future, about having clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and about fundamentally changing the systems around us. It's about peace, but also about having a just and sustainable world. This is not a single issue problem. It's not a problem that is only about the military, though that is a key component of the problems we face. But it's also about a long-range change in all of the ways in which humanity interacts with the natural world. We can't afford to, for example, the military and industry emit pollution that is, it's not just about having clean air to breathe, it's also emitting toxic chemicals that get into our food supply and our breathing. And some of those are called POPs, persistent organic pollutants, which can affect human and animal and plant reproductive systems. So this is about saving humanity in more ways than one, because our future depends on peace, it depends on having a sustainable environment, and it also has to do with a sustainable way of producing the goods that we need to live. But it's also about our ability to reproduce as a species. And I just want to note that while it's popular in some environmental circles to talk about the polar bears and the panda bears and all of the ways in which the sixth extinction is already harming animals and plants that we depend on for healthcare, for food, for medicines, for many other things. We can't organize the polar bears. It's only humans we can organize. So we have to recognize that our role as activists in whatever movements we're part of is about building those links, building that solidarity, and building that understanding within our own movements, by connecting movements, by engaging in joint action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. You have knit a lot of issues and organizations together, I think, in a very inspiring way, and I thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jim Driscoll, and it's going to be me that introduces him. Jim has a long record of anti-war activism. He co-founded the successful American peace test that got 13,000 arrested at the Nevada test site in 1985 to 1988. In 1991, he helped lead the resistance to the first Gulf War. In 2016, he set up and led Veterans Challenge Islamophobia for VFP to confront Trump's racism. He has been working full-time on climate change for 9 years and has been arrested 3 times so far in that fight. Jim will talk about the need for large-scale, nonviolent, direct actions to tell the truth about climate change and achieve a zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2025. I give you Jim.
This is a climate emergency. Our house is on fire. Put the fire out. Our house is on fire. Put the fire out. When we talk about climate change, we often talk about reaching net zero by 2050. The IPCC talks about getting rid of 45% of greenhouse gases by 2030. That's delusional. In your resource sheet, there's a reference to Climate Code Red, which is a wonderful source on information on climate, has been for a long time now. And they have a paper I cited there. We are already at 2 degrees centigrade, given the amount of CO2 and equivalents that are already in the atmosphere. There is no climate budget left at all for 2 degrees. So the question isn't, when does it make sense? We have to get rid of it all as fast as we possibly can. And Vets for Peace, I brought a resolution in 2017, adopted a resolution backing the climate mobilization, which basically said we have to get rid of all greenhouse gases within 10 years. That was in 2017. That would be 2027, which is the same year that we declared here in Montgomery County outside of DC where I live. That was an effort that I helped lead. So just to kind of give you a little bit of my history, like many of you, I've been working my whole life on this. I quit being a college professor 38 years ago, and I've been working full-time on social change ever since. But along around 2011, it occurred to me that we weren't going to be, there's no organizing on a dead planet. You can't do reforms if there are no human beings around to reform. And so I decided, as many of us have done in this audience, I'm sure, to focus my energies on climate change. I started out working with, I started out by going to get arrested with Bill McKibben and 1,100 close friends at the White House in 2011. But I started out with some of the more moderate groups with Citizens Climate Lobby, and then worked with 350. As I noted, then I went with the climate mobilization because it was clearer and clearer to me that we had to move quickly. And since 2018, I've been working with a group that many of you know of called Extinction Rebellion. And basically, I'm going to argue that we should all consider working with Extinction Rebellion. If there's a local group in your hometown, then work with them. If there isn't, then set one up. There's a form at the in the resource sheet, at the bottom of the resource sheet, where you can fill in what you're interested in volunteering with Veterans for Peace. And if you check Extinction Rebellion, we can work. I'll be happy to work with you, getting you in touch with local groups, but also getting started. So the basic notion behind Extinction Rebellion is you have to tell the climate truth, like I just did. And it's not decades in the future, it's here now. We need to get rid of everything quickly, which is the World War II, I hate to use that analogy, militaristic analogy, for changing our society in order to get rid of greenhouse gases. The other piece of it is that it calls for mass, nonviolent, direct action. Until we get large numbers of people in the streets, and obviously it's difficult in these times, and some of us have to be even more careful than the rest of us, but it's always been true that unless you have large numbers of people willing to take action, socially distanced, masked, in cars, whatever it is, to disrupt the operations of society, things don't change. And what most of us, I'm sure, have been out like me, out with the Black Lives Movement repeatedly in the last few months. Unless you get that scale of action and that kind of consistent action, you don't get change. The government ratifies change. It never gives credit to the mass movements for change. But if you look at the Vietnam War, which was central to a lot of our lives, it took large numbers of people in the streets risking arrest, civil rights, the right to have unions, women's rights, gay rights, throughout our history. And this has been written up and researched. Some of you know Erica Chenworth and Gene Sharp and others research. Unless you have that kind of mobilization, you don't get change. So if extinction didn't exist, Extinction Rebellion would have to invent it. Here out here in Montgomery County, I mean, we did an action over Earth Day where we did it in cars, because some of us were still, this was April, reluctant to go out in cars, go out in person. And we got in the Washington Post, we get on TV, so you can get coverage in kind of innovative sort of ways. And the issue I want to address a little bit is, how do you connect the climate with social justice? They can't, as all the speakers have said, be separate. So we have to mobilize people, whether it's on climate or otherwise. Here in DC, what we did was we set up an intersectional group called Shut Down DC. And that gave us a mechanism to involve and work with Black Lives Matter, La Colectivo is an immigrant rights group that's working against Amazon. So over the Earth Day, the week after Earth Day, we supported the young people the week before. But in that next week, we had Black Lives Matter picked sort of their focus and their location. We followed them. La Collectiva did the same. We followed them. Sunrise did the same. So we brought that kind of intersectional gathering together one day at a time. And now, as we're going forward, we're groups that have worked together in the streets and are ready to do more action. So right now, our group here in DC has concluded that the biggest obstacle to climate change, the top priority for the climate movement right now, is Donald Trump, the greatest climate denier of all time. So what we have done is begun to focus on some issues that we discussed last night around the election. The election is going to be contested. It's been contested right now on voter suppression. It's going to be contested around mail-in ballots. It's going to require protest, as well as lawyers, as well as people filling out postcards and such. So we're going to be looking for opportunities to take action that works on these elections in coalition and in support with other groups that are more traditionally involved. We're working with the postal unions, for example, on mail-in ballots, on some of the people of color organizations that have historically focused on voter rights, that are already doing work to have people at the polling places so that when the Boogaloo boys show up there are other people to give people the confidence to go in and vote. But it doesn't end on the election, because then we're going to have to make sure that they actually count all the mail-in votes, because Trump will be saying just count election day. Then we have to make sure that the state legislatures, particularly in the swing states, are going to follow the results of the voting and send those electors. And we're going to have to work on Congress to make sure that the electors are proper. It's going to be likely from November 3rd till January 20th, not to mention before that. So what I would like to invite you to do is to go into that voter, that volunteer form that's on the resource sheet, and I'll put it in the chat box if it's not there already, and let us know if you're interested in Extinction Rebellion, if you're interested in this broad election-focused direct action campaign that's going to be going on from now until January 20th. And we can we're going to be active in DC, but we're networking, we're trying to bring folks together because we're a group of people who have done direct action for a long time. There are people there that go back to Seattle in 1990. I was at the test site, Standing Rock, Ferguson, you name it. And the NGOs that are already meeting and talking about this really that isn't their thing. And so after November 3rd, when all of a sudden everybody says, oh, we have to go into the streets, we want to have things ready. We want to have the trainings done, the convergence space rented, the communication structure in place, the relationships built, so that everybody can sort of slide into it. So I'd like to invite you to join that. And as has been said so many times, veterans' voices are crucial to this. I mean, the military, is going to be trying to may at some crucial point have to make a tough decision about what to do. And the more that we can have veterans leading these protests, involved in these protests, when we're going out with Black Lives Matter, we stand back and advance their issues. In this case, we're both all in it together, and veterans have a particularly important voice to contribute. So we're going to have to be alert to do that. And based on a session we had last night, I'm pretty sure our Vets for Peace and Garrett's supporter of this last night is going to have a project in Vets for Peace to connect up with this larger shutdown or whatever we call this direct action campaign that goes from now till the end of January. And so on that resource sheet, there are lots of things about information, about lobbying, about many kind of organizations doing a range of things that you can do. I want you to give some attention to that. Right after this session, we're going to fold seamlessly electronically into a support group for climate activists that Steve Morris and Vince DeJanic are pulling together within Vets for Peace to support people who are working on climate. And you can sign up for that there in that form, even if you're not going to be able to join us for the next hour. So there are a range of things in there to consider, and I'd urge you to consider in particular direct action through Extinction Rebellion. I want to make sure you go to Extinction Rebellion US, because unfortunately there's some splits back and forth, and Extinction US is really focused on racial justice, a just transition, reparations. We are clear, and here in Montgomery County, we're working on a Green New Deal locally, that we have to have a movement that's led by and supportive of frontline communities. And I can connect you with that. There's some other folks around using the XR kind of label that are less clear about the importance of racism. So I will, if that sheet is not there, oh, sorry, you will be informed by Garrett about how exactly you get into this next session, but it does follow right after this. Apparently there's going to be some electronic magic. So just to remind you that what we have to do, we'll put the climate, and wherever you are, get reminded that Vets for Peace is largely about protesting. It's okay to protest. You can protest on your front lawn. You can protest in your neighborhood, in your hometown. But let's have a climate emergency sign up. And one more time, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. We're all in this together, and some of us are going to have to be in the streets. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Inspiring. And I'm glad you mentioned what's coming next with Vince and with Steve Morris and Vince DeJanic. I see we have a number of questions here, and I think Lindsay are you there, Lindsay? Are you picking up those questions so you can pass them on? I don't hear Lindsay.
I think Marion was going to do that.
Oh, okay. Marion?
I think Lindsay offered to do that, but she's on mute right now, and I'm not too sure she knows that.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
There's Lindsay. There's Lindsay. Yeah, have you picked up the questions down here?
Yes, we have a bunch of questions. And so I'll start with this one, and it doesn't have a person's name, but Chapter 91, Veterans for Peace, asks, what would you suggest as the most potent 2 facts or statements you would use to catch the attention of climate activists to engage them in the cause of linking climate damage and US militarism? And I will not take the questioner's prerogative to go first, so someone else should take it.
I'll jump in on that one. It's a great question. I would say that number 1 is, for a climate activist, lots of people will tell you that the Green New Deal sounds great and come back with, but how you're gonna pay for it? And the answer is, stop paying 53 cents of every federal dollar into the military, cut $350 billion, cut that in half, and use that money to begin the work on the Green New Deal. That's fact number 1. Fact number 2, I would say, is this notion that the Pentagon produces more greenhouse gases than a bunch of countries, and that's just not okay. Along with killing people around the world, it's destroying the earth. That's another one that can be really powerful.
Good. Lindsay, got another question?
Well, actually, I'm gonna give an answer to that one, and I love Phyllis's too, and I'm just gonna add a little bit, which it's kind of weaselly, but I'm gonna say it depends on who you're talking to. You know, certainly, I think younger climate activists are very open to questions of racial justice, and they recognize, you know, their key word for everything is intersectional. So making those connections can be a bit easier, I think, there. But I think there it's important to talk about, you know, how our wars and our Pentagon pollution has unfairly targeted Black and brown people, Indigenous people, and I think that is a very compelling argument to a lot of younger activists. All right, let's see. Another question. We have a couple of that are along similar lines, but let's depart from that a bit. All right, this is another sort of activism question. What are your thoughts on peace communities, communal land trusts, communities that organize around issues and take collective positions, work to create internal and sustainable economies, form important allied communities, tax resistance, etc.? So there's a lot in that question. And I would say, if you want to pick up on any part of it, I would say to speak up.
Okay. Well, my response to that is that all of those are great things to the extent that they can work, and like making individual changes by themselves, they're not enough because of the systems embedded around us that are continuing to create the problems. They're regenerating the problems. Even when we fix one, it gets worse. So all communities, alternative, cooperatives, all of those things can be done in a way that is helpful for peace and helpful for the environment and helpful for the economy, and none of them are solutions by themselves unless they're part of that broader movement that addresses the underlying problems, these systems that encompass us, which are creating the biggest part of the problem. The other piece of it is that actions like those, like actions of individuals, are best when they are multiplied and adopted by many, many people. It's not enough. it's not about personal purity. It's not about saying, well, I'm going to have the smallest carbon footprint possible of any human being in the world, so therefore I win. It's about making those changes in society that are causing the problem. So I'm all for alternatives. I'm all for individual changes, but we also have to understand the bigger context in which we operate.
Can I say something here? I agree with that. And I also realize that an awful lot of people know very, very little about all the things that we've been talking about. A lot of people that I encounter in my building, on the street and so forth, they know very, very little. I think if we just make ourselves available to those people and suggest to them that they get involved somewhere, somehow, as a start in the awakening of themselves to all the massive issues that we've been talking about here. You know, there have been so many aspects that have been brought to light by every speaker here that it could be overwhelming to anybody encountering it for the first time. It's even overwhelming to me, and I'm not encountering it for the first time. Think of all the people that you know who are of goodwill, but don't know what the heck to do. You give them something to do, some little activist venture, some little progressive thing, and then build on that. And as their awarenesses increase, then we're going to be able to build these more comprehensive movements.
If I can just add one point to what Woody was just saying and to Marc's point, I agree with both of you. And I think that we also have to broaden our understanding precisely because this is such an emergency moment. It's a climate emergency, it's a racism emergency, it's a war emergency, it's all those things. And I think that we have to broaden our understanding of what our movement is so that the cooperative movement, if you look at the work going on in Jackson, for instance, where it's an African-American initiative that's been going on for years to build a cooperative, self-sufficient community, that's an extraordinary accomplishment. That is part of our climate movement and it's part of our anti-war movement. So we need to claim that and welcome that as part of it. I think we have in the past at times been too worried about how do we build the anti-war movement? How do we build the peace movement? And others have been worried about how do we build the environmental justice movement? And others worried about how do we build the women's movement? And with the discussion of intersectionality, I think that means not only how we define the problems that we face and understand we have to build movements around all of them, but that we have to also recognize that the climate movement is a peace movement. The peace movement is objectively a movement to defend the climate. And so people do different parts of that work. It's a big problem. There's room for a really big movement. So all the things that people want to do, whether it's doing study groups and learning more stuff and figuring out how to do individual whatever, whether it's building alternatives, we need to have alternatives that can inspire people, not just about what we're against, but what we're for, what can come next. You know, I think that's such an important part of what our movements globally are all about. So I would just urge us to keep looking really broadly at all of these things. We have to do them all, and we need them all, and they're all part of our movement.
Right on, right. Any more questions there?
Yes, and here's another. How do we talk to our congressional reps to get attention on military-caused greenhouse gas emissions?
Bring a bunch of people with you.
Did you say that again?
You kicked out. You say it again. Mark.
Bring a whole bunch of people with you when you go, because again, it's not about convincing the politicians through reasoned argument. I'm not opposed to reasoned argument. That's part of the process. It's not just about having the moral high ground. It's also about convincing them that there's a political price to pay if they don't act. And that comes from large numbers of people and the power that large numbers of people represent. So when you go by yourself or write your own letter, absolutely, that's a good thing to do. But if 100 of you do it, they'll listen a lot harder.
True.
Could I piggyback on that, Woody? It's not just, I totally agree, it's, as you'd expect, a large number of people is important. But as, what did John Lewis say? Good trouble. People who are willing to be impolite when they're dealing with members of Congress, because to a large extent, members of Congress and their staff exist to cool us out, to chill us down, to keep us from being pushy. And so, yeah, some of us are going to go in and give the reasoned arguments and give the facts and figures. But really, what they're about is maintaining the conditions of business as usual where capitalism can make a profit. And if it looks like, as it does now around defunding the police and some more progress on Black lives, if it looks like something's got to be done, then all of a sudden the NFL, baseball, I mean, the whole society, all the big corporations say, "Oh yes, of course, we've been for that forever, didn't you know?" And so it does take more than just, you know, what do you say to your member of Congress so that she or he will like you and listen to you? They're never going to tell you why they changed their minds, and a lot of times it's because things looked like they were getting out of control, and our job is to put them on that edge as often as we can.
Absolutely, and there's so many ways of doing that. It means people in the streets and people in the suites, as people like to say. You need all of it. You need an outside strategy and an inside strategy, where some people sit down with the members of Congress and say, look, you're missing the fact that your base has changed dramatically in the last 5 years, and if you don't catch up with it, you're going to lose in the next election. And others, in the meantime, are protesting in the street, proving the point. So you need the combination of all of those things. It goes to the breadth of the kinds of movements that we need. We need all of it.
I think you also have to kind of step back a little bit. And so, you know, you could say that I want to convince my congressional representative that military greenhouse gas emissions are a bad thing. But why is that the thing you need to convince them of? Is it, you know, if the goal is to address climate change, or the goal is to stop wars and address the militarization of our world and our society, that opens up, you have a lot of other things that you can focus on. And you want to target what you're focusing on to who you're talking to the member of Congress you're talking to. And you need to build, and all of those new other avenues create ways to build ties to other movements, so that you're not just the people who want to stop the military from fossil fuel emissions. Because that's going to be a smaller number of people. All right. Let's see.
You know, let me just one thing here.
Yeah.
To visit Claire McCaskill once in DC to talk about getting off fossil fuels in Missouri. And she was very honest with me. She says, that, you know, most of her money comes from the coal industry for her reelection. I didn't really have a good answer to that, because our elections really depend upon, I mean, people get elected because they can spend enough money to get elected. And that's a very, very sad but important truth. I don't know how to break through that. I think if I talked to Claire today, now that she's no longer a senator, I think she'd probably agree with me, and that would be fine. But every one of these people have somebody that they owe. And I don't know how to make an end run around that, if you will. If anybody's got a suggestion, I would love to hear it.
I think one aspect of how we get around it is the question of expose. It's embarrassing. And it's right. Something, you know, I've never been one for conspiracy theories. I don't think there are very many conspiracies. But there's one thing that I think had to be a conspiracy, because I can't figure out any other way it could have happened, which was the moments after World War II, when these corporations that were producing military hardware, military goods, military contractors of various sorts, were trying to figure out how can they continue to make a huge amount of money when the US is no longer at war. This is before the new wars came along. And somehow I always imagined there had to be a meeting, some secret meeting with a secret handshake and a secret decoder ring in somebody's office somewhere, because otherwise it doesn't make sense that they all figured out that the way to do that was to produce this stuff in the least efficient way possible. So that instead of producing stuff efficiently, which means you produce everything in one place, each item that goes into producing a plane or a bomb or whatever is made in the same place, and then you put them all together, and then you have them, and then you send them to wherever they have to go. They don't do that for this stuff. They make it the least efficient way possible, meaning that the first little widget that has to be the base of something is made in one place and then is shipped across the country to be added to some other little widget that makes it slightly bigger, and then that gets shipped somewhere else. And the result is that almost every single congressional district, all 435 congressional districts, have some jobs that are dependent on that military construction. And the member of Congress, no matter what we do, is not going to be willing to vote against something that provides jobs in their community. So that's where we get to this whole question of what's it going to take to show people, and there's great facts and figures on this in the NPP website, about how if you invest the same amount of money, if you take say $1 million and you invest it in military jobs, you'll get, I don't remember, Lindsay probably knows this in her head and I don't, you'll get so many jobs. You'll get, say, 20 jobs out of that $1 million. But if you invested that same $1 million in healthcare jobs, education jobs, and green manufacturing jobs, you'd get way more than the number of jobs you'd get for the military. So we have to figure out how to make real this idea of a just transition. To say, yeah, you're right, we're not going to have a 55-year-old coal miner who's going to become a computer programmer, right? That's not going to happen. But what could happen is that people who are working in factories can work in those same factories when they've been retooled to manufacture whatever it is, whether it's
Wind turbines or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, wind turbines or solar panels instead of the weapons that they were producing, and that there's more job money available for that. It's not easy, and people will be sacrificed for it. That's part of the problem. There will be individuals who will be hurt by that. A generation will be saved by it, but some individuals will be hurt, and we have to figure out ways of supporting that. That means looking at things like the universal basic income and all those alternative things that are out there. But we have to be creative and say, this is why it's so hard. This is why even anti-war members of Congress are going to be really reluctant, because there's jobs at stake. And that's what we have to be prepared to challenge about.
I wanted to also make clear that because I do think protesting is, we got a lot of organizations spending a lot of time and money educating and being nice to the members of Congress. And I think it'd be very important in this next period to go out in your own locale, because the kind of pressure we're going to have to put on Trump and all the members of Congress, Joe Biden, if we're lucky, couldn't imagine much worse of a candidate, much rather have him than the alternative. But unless we go out now and connect up with Black Lives Matter, with the immigrant rights groups in our home communities, and sort of say, okay, we have this problem from now until January. This is a time when we all have a common focus. All of our issues are kind of united. We know that if we A, don't beat them decisively in the election, and B, if it's anywhere near close, even if it's only in some of the swing states, we're going to have to do more than just beat them. We're going to have to push them out somehow. This is a time to reach out and make those connections in your local community, not just here in Washington, D.C. I mean, groups like ours will be doing some of the work in DC, providing support and some kind of networking. But every place where we are, this is the time when you can go and say, we have a common enemy, we have a common problem. How can we, tell me more about immigrant rights. I'll tell you more about the military budget. But whatever we got to do, we got to be out and we got to be down with the postal union demanding more money for mail-in ballots, or we've got to be standing with the NAACP or whatever the group is that's going to be at the voting places, making sure that people that do go to vote in person are able. So this is a real important opportunity to build coalition, but also when people are ready for more edgy action, of which many of us think, we really need a lot more of.
Good, Jim. Good. Anything more?
There are more questions. Should we
I can imagine.
put another one out there?
Sure.
All right. Speak to the Kyoto, Paris, and Paris Climate Accords exempting military activity.
This is something that goes far beyond just the international treaties. This reflects a culture of, we talk about American exceptionalism and the need to challenge American exceptionalism. Within that, there's a military exceptionalism that exists in virtually every country in the world, where the military is privileged and is not held accountable. Whether it's things like, officially in the US, you have to do an environmental impact study to build pretty much anything. You don't have to in the same way if it's a military something or other. They're exempt from those requirements. And that's it's a huge issue. You see it most overtly in the language of these international treaties, and it's one of the reasons why they're as weak as they are, because the biggest producers of the dangerous stuff are exempt. But I think it is a much bigger problem than just within those treaties. It goes in the United States, it's fundamental because the military, and you see this in everything from the cultural stuff about how the militarization of baseball games, when people stand with the flag and you have military people doing various things and, coming into the opening of sports events and that sort of thing. The education part of it, the idea of something like junior ROTC and all of this leads to this sense that the military is special. The military is to be given privileges that are available to no other part of our society. And this is the reflection of that. So it's a huge cultural shift that we have to accomplish.
If I could add just a bit about none of the things that are proposed, even the most advanced programs by themselves are enough. The Paris Climate Accords are not the answer. They're one step, and I'm an advocate of the idea that partial progress and partial victories are necessary to get to the fundamental change we need. We just shouldn't confuse them. So the Paris Climate Accords were a big advance, but even if they didn't exempt the military, and even if they were complied with 100%, and even if they had enforcement powers, it wouldn't have been enough. It's not enough by itself. So we need to take these partial victories and recognize them both as victories and as partial. The Paris Climate Accord, the Green New Deal, as sweeping as it is, as big a step as it is towards addressing the real scale of the problem, unlike most previous efforts, won't be enough by itself. These are all steps. They are things to fight for. They're tools to fight for. They're partial victories to celebrate, but they are partial. And even if the Paris Climate Accords were better, and even if we adopted the Green New Deal tomorrow, that wouldn't be a reason to stop, because it wouldn't be enough. So we have to recognize that they are imperfect. Electing Biden, who knows what battles that we will still have ahead of us, but stopping fascism is a first step. And recognize that that's all it is. It's not a solution that will carry us through, and he's not a hero who's going to solve the problems for us, nor is the Green New Deal, nor are the Paris Climate Accords, even if they were better than they are. So understanding that broad scope, and the scope, understanding the scope of the problem is part of the key to building the links, because our enemies are telling us who we need to be allied with. The enemies of Black Lives Matter are the enemies of environmental regulation, are the enemies of unions, are the enemies of full voter participation, are the enemies of women's health, and LGBTQ LGBTQ right, all of those things, they're telling us who we need as allies. And understanding the scope of the problem is also understanding the scope of the movement we need to fix things.
Well said. Well said.
Are we scheduled to end at 8:30 or 7:30?
Yeah,
Yes.
we're getting
Yes.
messages.
Yes.
Depending on your frame of view.
Yes.
All
Do you
right.
have a burning question there?
Well, I'm sure lots of these people would love their questions answered. But I don't know if maybe should we do one more before we wrap up, or?
I think the other group is actually starting now. So
There's another group.
Yeah.
We should let people go to that maybe.
It's supposed to be a follow-up on this. Garrett, are you going to
Yeah.
hand off?
Okay, then we'll wrap it up and thank you all so very much. It's been a wonderful discussion.
Yeah, thanks everyone. As soon as you get kicked out of this room, the meeting room should be available and you can jump in. You might have to refresh your agenda page for that watch button to appear, but it should appear soon and we'll join you in the discussion. Thank you, panel. That was outstanding. I appreciate all of your commitments to this issue because it intersects every other issue. We have to solve this. So thank you everyone and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Garrett,
Bye-bye.
can you save the Q&A for the ones that aren't answered?
I will save it. Yep, you bet.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks.